Hello, welcome to our Product Safety Certification for North America webinar. Thank you for joining us today. This webinar is being given by Met Laboratories. Met is a leader in the testing of electrical and electronic equipment for environmental hardiness, product safety, and electromagnetic compatibility. Met operates world-class labs in Baltimore, Maryland, Santa Clara and Union City, California, Austin, Texas, and also runs operations in China, Taiwan, Korea, and Italy. This webinar will run about 45 minutes with an additional 15 minutes for questions and answers. Due to the number of registrants, all attendees will have their phones muted. If you have a question, please type it in the questions area of your control panel. We will attempt to answer all questions at the end. Today's webinar is being presented by Roland Gutsky. Roland is Met's European Business Development Manager. At this point, I will hand over the presentation to Roland.
Thanks very much for attending this presentation on North American product safety requirements. As Barnaby mentioned, my name is Roland Gutsky, and I am the EU Business Development Manager for Met Laboratories. Currently, I maintain an office outside of Milan, Italy, which is where I am speaking to you today. This presentation briefly gives a history of Met Labs, then describes the requirements for electrical products used in North America and the process by which those requirements are met. If you were invited by one of our partner labs to attend this presentation, please follow up with that partner lab if you want to pursue a program of certification for North America. If you've reached this presentation by other means, please contact me at info@metlabs.com and I can assist you further. The entire presentation should take no more than 30 to 40 minutes, and I'll try to leave time at the end to answer questions that may have been collected during the presentation. In 1959, the founder of Met Labs, Leonard Fryer, discovered there was a need for testing large electrical distribution systems for utility companies. He spent the next several years working with these companies up and down the east coast of America to provide testing in the field. As time passed, he began getting inquiries from several western states to test other electrical products. At that time, there weren't any regulations on the national or federal level regarding workplace safety, and instead, each state had its own set of requirements. What this meant was that if you were trying to sell your product in Oregon, there was one set of rules. Ohio and Florida may have a different set of rules. In 1970, OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, was established to handle, among other things, the question of product safety in the workplace. This formation triggered a series of events which over the next 18 years eventually created the NRTL industry. We'll talk more about this in depth in a few minutes. But in 1989, Met was recognized as the first NRTL, entering the product safety testing industry along with the likes of UL and Factory Mutual. The gentleman in the photo on this slide on the left is Leonard Fryer, and he's the founder of Met Labs. Met grew very rapidly over the next 10 years, expanding from one person involved in product safety to a group of 25 people. Near the end of the century, Met opened its first offices in California before expanding into Asia in 2006. Since then, Met has continued to grow, opening a second lab in California and another in Texas. In 2012, I was relocated to Italy to start our European operations. This map shows where we are located in the United States. We have labs that stretch from coast to coast. Baltimore remains our main headquarters and our largest location. At present, we maintain engineering in China and sales support offices in Korea and Taiwan. As I mentioned, I maintain an office outside of Milan, where our main function is to support the efforts of our partner labs in the UK and on the European continent. Now that you know a little bit more about Met, we'll talk about the NRTL program. What exactly is an NRTL? Nationally recognized testing laboratories are independent third-party test labs that are recognized by OSHA as capable of providing testing and certification for products entering the workplace. The standards that are used in this testing are developed by American-based standards ratings organizations such as ANSI, AAMI, and UL. Section 1910.308 is the part of the Code of Federal Regulations that require that all equipment used in the workplace bear the mark of an NRTL. Now, although the original rules gave two examples of these organizations, UL and Factory Mutual, they did not include a process by which another lab could meet this requirement. Met Lab's founder, Len Fryer, filed suit to have that language removed, and in 1983, a court ordered that references to UL and FM be removed. Another 5 years passed before OSHA, by direction of another court order, formally established the guidelines to recognize laboratories. Met, as it would follow, became the first NRTL to ever be audited and accredited by OSHA. This occurred in 1989. Incidentally, UL did not gain NRTL status officially until 1995. So what does certification really mean? There are basically 4 points to consider. The first is that a qualified and recognized lab, an NRTL, is determined through testing that a product meets the requirements of an applicable product standard, and that the lab has issued a certificate to that effect. Third, it means that the manufacturer can now place the mark of that laboratory on the product, announcing that it is compliant for use in the workplace. And finally, it means that the product is monitored for continuing compliance to that standard by regular inspections where the product is less tested and labeled. One of the most common questions I answer is my product required to be certified? As I mentioned before, law requires that all electrical products used in the workplace must bear an NRTL mark. Unlike Europe, self-declaration is not sufficient to meet this requirement. In addition to CFR 1910, there are other market forces at work which deem product safety testing mandatory. These include the NFPA, but also requirements from insurance regulators, buyers, and other third parties. In America, there are dozens of national retailers. Some of those are Best Buy, Home Depot, Target, Sears, Walmart, and many, many others. Over time, these companies have adopted the same rules and require electrical products sold through their outlets to bear an NRTL mark. The second most commonly asked question is, since UL writes the safety standards, don't manufacturers need to display a UL mark? The answer to that question is no. UL is very well known in the marketplace and is associated with product safety testing probably more than any other lab in America, largely because of their involvement in the standards writing process. While many of the standards that OSHA has recognized are prefaced with UL, such as UL 6950 or 611010, they are just one of many organizations that write standards. And in fact, today UL is actually two separate and distinct organizations. One is the standards writing business, and the other is the testing laboratory. So that gives you a basic understanding of the program and the legal requirements. Now, what exactly happens during a safety certification? Basically, the standards exist to address 7 areas or hazards that can exist when you're using electrical equipment. The standards are there to ensure that as much of this hazard is eliminated as possible. Obviously, with electricity, there could be shocks to the user or problems caused by energy like short circuits. These can result in electrocution and fire. But there are also mechanical tests that address things like sharp edges, or the ability of someone's finger to penetrate an enclosure and get to where high voltage exists. In addition, there are other hazards that they try to mitigate for things like radiation. These are hazards such as sound, infrared, ultraviolet, and visible light. Lasers, for instance, pose their own set of hazards, and there are specific rules applying with equipment that contains them. Finally, there are chemical hazards which can occur when there is contact or inhalation of vapors or fumes. The evaluation is composed of two main areas. The first is a constructional review. This takes place first and considers the enclosure as well as the layout of the components and the materials. Standards also dictate how information must be presented in the documentation, including user manuals and service guides. During the constructional review, an engineer will go through a standard clause by clause, and they'll note whether the clause is applicable and whether the equipment passes or fails. Any clause that the equipment does not pass is marked as a nonconformity. These nonconformities are noted and included on a document called a findings report. At the end of the constructional review, the findings are presented to the client, and they're given the opportunity to rectify the nonconformities. Also during the first stage, the engineer is going to develop a test plan that will be carried out to test characteristics such as thermals, dielectric strength, input current, and abnormal operation tests. During the second stage, the actual testing of the product is carried out. If a product fails a test, this is relayed to the client and they take corrective action. As you can see, this is an iterative process most of the time. Rarely have I seen a product enter and exit the process without some sort of nonconformity coming to the fore. It could be as minor as missing text in a manual to the product bursting into flames during one of the tests. One of the deliverables on every project is the list of safety critical components. The list of safety critical components is one that the engineer has identified as impacting the product's ability to meet the requirements of the safety standard. It might be the flammability rating on the enclosure. It could be a safety switch or batteries. It could be any number of components. This list is very important because it constitutes what are the control components within the product. Anytime a control component on this list is altered, it must first be evaluated by the lab to ensure that the change is not going to render the product unsafe. Every NRTL has a process for handling changes to safety critical components, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later. In Europe, very often manufacturers will want to use components that have the CE mark. This isn't adequate for products that enter North America. If a component is on the list of those indicated as safety critical, they must have an NRTL listing or recognition. A CE mark is not enough. In fact, the CE mark means nothing in the United States at all. So what if there's no way around this? You may use uncertified components, but it's going to require additional effort and cost. NRTLs are first required to evaluate that component during the initial project, and then to reevaluate the same component every year to maintain compliance of the product. Dependent upon the component, this may indicate or may actually involve retesting. If the NRTL report indicates that a component requires annual evaluation, factory inspectors go collect a random sample during one of the follow-up inspections. At this point, you might be wondering what inspections. Unlike Europe, OSHA requires that every product bearing an NRTL mark be inspected at its point of final assembly and testing a minimum of twice a year. The first time a product is tested and listed, the NRTL is going to visit your factory and inspect your procedures and manufacturing to ensure that you have a minimum of written policies and procedures to make the product consistently. If your company has an ISO 9000 certification, this is going to be pretty simple to achieve because the requirements of the NRTL program are a subset of those ISO requirements. The NRTL is going to look at how you document changes to the product, how you check and quarantine incoming materials, how customer complaints are handled, and so on. Once the PCFI is completed, you can mark the product. During the follow-up inspections, the NRTL will also ensure that any testing that is required in the report is conducted on site and records are maintained. Almost all equipment that connects to mains power is going to require dielectric strength testing and ground continuity testing. Also, the inspector will compare your list of safety critical components to a random sample pulled from your production and ensure that the same components are in the final product. All of these procedures are requirements of OSHA, and they protect the integrity of the NRTL mark and the program itself. By applying an NRTL mark, you're stating to the world that your product meets the requirement of the standard, and the mark is proof of that. In addition, you're separating yourselves from others by announcing that you're committed to producing safe products and that your quality system is monitored by a third party, in this case the NRTL that holds your listing. This is an example of a label that would be affixed to a compliant product. Obviously, the NRTL mark is indicated, stating which laboratory tested the product. The C in the lower left-hand corner indicates that this product meets the requirements for Canada as well as the U.S. Also, the names of the standards are listed on the product so that they know what standard it was tested to. Not all products are tested at an NRTL. There are a number of other programs that exist that manufacturers can take advantage of for a number of different scenarios. One common instance would be a manufacturer such as Coca-Cola. They make their own vending machines in all kinds of different sizes and shapes. They actually maintain their own testing laboratories which are audited by NRTLs. The NRTL can accept their test data and provide their reports. Also, field labeling is another area that's something that does not happen in the actual lab of an NRTL. Sometimes manufacturers will produce just one of something, and it will be needed to be installed somewhere in the United States, and it could be too big, or the application of it is so specific that it just doesn't lend itself well to a laboratory investigation. In cases like that, there are people who will go out and will actually investigate your product at the installation and label it so that it still meets the NRTL requirements and the OSHA requirements. So what if your project changes? We understand that over time your product is likely to change. Also, you may move your manufacturing at one point or another. Anytime your NRTL report changes, a PAR must be completed. The most important thing to remember about a PAR is that they must be dealt with before you make whatever change it is you're trying to make. If an inspector shows up and finds that you're using a component in your product that doesn't match the list of safety critical components, you're going to be cited for a non-compliance. Similarly, if an inspector shows up at your door in Paris, France, and there's a sign saying that you moved your factory to Madrid, you're going to be out of compliance until the NRTL evaluates your new location with a PCFI. It's also worth mentioning at this point that if your product requires production line testing for dielectric strength or ground continuity, the equipment that is used to perform those tests requires annual calibration. If you fail to keep up the calibration programs, you could wind up not being able to mark your product until the calibration is performed. So why do we do all this? Well, obviously the first reason is to comply with federal law. However, there are other authorities having jurisdiction over installations of equipment, all the way down to your local and state fire marshal and building inspector. All of these look for NRTL marks as evidence that your product is safe for people to use. The reason that the authorities having jurisdiction exist is that they make sure that all the proper safety regulations are being followed and that your equipment doesn't endanger people. What I hope you take away from this presentation is that OSHA is in charge of the program and not UL. OSHA recognizes labs and standards as meeting the federal requirements. NRTLs are the labs whose marks meet those requirements. Equipment and material that meets the requirements of the standards are marked and listed, and the standards in the program are developed by US-based standards writing organizations. Throughout this presentation, I mentioned that OSHA requires testing to be performed with the involvement of an NRTL. Over time, OSHA, as well as most of the rest of the industrial world, has recognized that companies now operate and sell globally. To facilitate this, the IEC-EE created the CB scheme, which allows manufacturers to get a report from a participating lab that will be accepted by more than 50 countries. There are often national deviations that must be taken into consideration, which may require some additional testing, but by and large, this is a huge leap forward over what previously existed. The one drawback of the OSHA system is that the requirement that a product sample must be sent with the report. This is often not practical given distances, shipping costs, or in the interest of time. To relieve this burden, Met developed a system which is approved by OSHA to work with other qualified labs around the world. Basically, we qualify these partner labs through a quality and technical audit. Once a lab successfully completes this audit, we're able to then accept their reports without the need for them to send a product sample. The result is that you, the manufacturer, continues to work with your local lab, and you're able to gain access to North America easily and affordably. Here's a slide that shows the logos of some of the labs we work with around the globe. If you were referred to this webinar by one of these labs, please contact them to talk more about a test program for North America. One of the points I wanted to bring up before we take any questions is that there are always many standards that are in transition. Here I've listed 4 of the most popular that have either been changed recently or are going to change recently. UL 61010, which is deals with laboratory test and control equipment, is going to be replaced in January by a 2nd edition. The European change for that particular standard is going to occur in October. So if you make laboratory test control or measurement devices, be aware of that change. One of the biggest topics in discussion right now concerns medical devices. If you are involved in medical devices, you know that Europe and Canada are now requiring devices meet IEC 60601 3rd edition. In the United States, OSHA has not yet recognized that standard. So presently, if you're trying to get into the United States, you still have to produce a 2nd edition report if you're going to go the CB route. To add to the complication, the FDA is going to start requiring the 3rd edition after July of this year. So conceivably, you could be faced with having to produce a CB report to both 2nd and 3rd edition. We believe that OSHA is going to address this situation, but we don't know when. You can monitor our website, metlabs.com, and we send out messages all the time whenever we get news from entity accrediting bodies as far as when standards are going to change. UL 1604 is a standard that deals with Class 1 Division 2 applications. Last July, that standard was withdrawn by OSHA and has been replaced by this ANSI standard. It's an example of, actually medical devices and 1604 are two examples of standards being withdrawn and replaced by standards written by someone other than UL. The standard that's going to be in effect in the United States is an AAMI standard, and the 1604 has been replaced by an ANSI standard. The next major change is going to take place in probably the next 2 to 5 years, and it's going to be that 6950 and 60065 are going to be withdrawn and likely replaced by a standard based on IEC 62368. The reason for this is that over the past couple of decades, the distinctions between IT equipment and audio-visual equipment have blurred, and the new IEC standard is going to reflect this trend, and so 6950 and 60065 will no longer exist. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Barnaby, and we're going to try to get to some questions.
Great. Thank you, Roland. That concludes the presentation portion of this webinar. A copy of the webinar will be available on metlabs.com. We will send a follow-up email with a link to this file. Now we will answer questions. If you have a question, please type it in the questions area of your control panel. For questions we can easily address now, we will read the question aloud, then give the answer. We have a few questions that have already come in, and Roland will be addressing those.
Okay, where do I see the questions?
They should be right in your control panel there, Roland.
Perhaps you could read it to me, Barnaby.
Sure. Is NRTL required for both commercial, industrial products and domestic products?
Okay, the answer to that is the legal requirement that an NRTL mark satisfied is really to satisfy the requirements of the workplace. But over time is that the same requirements. And one of the reasons for that is that in the United States, the only thing we have in greater number is lawyers. And if someone gets hurt using a product, typically lawyers get involved very quickly. And they're going to go after whoever manufactured that product, whoever sold that product, anybody who had anything to do with that product. So in order to protect themselves, retailers have begun to adopt the same requirements, and they rely upon the NRTL mark to demonstrate that a product is safe.
Next question. Would a mobile phone with internal battery and AC charger fall within the scope of this program? Presumably, UL 6950 would be required for the whole system?
You will usually see an NRTL mark on cell phones. And strictly speaking, battery-operated devices, say devices that use dry cell batteries, non-rechargeable types. Strictly speaking, those are not required to be marked unless they're used in a hazardous location. However, when you talk about rechargeable batteries, you're going to have a charger that connects to the mains power. So usually you're going to see NRTL marks on cell phones.
Hey, Roland, can you put your PowerPoint back up so folks can see your you and your partner's contact information? Good. Okay, next question.
You got it?
Do one-off items such as engineering or production test equipment need NRTL marking if they are compliant to calibration procedures?
Again, this is a situation that is likely going to require a field label. As I mentioned earlier, there are other programs that address equipment that doesn't really lend itself to testing in a lab, and one-off and prototype and equipment that is being placed in the field fall under that category. Just because it's a prototype or an evaluation unit doesn't relieve any of the regulations requiring its use in the workplace. However, you can, rather than go through an entire type evaluation and have to deal with the factory inspections and everything else that goes along with that, a field label is designed to handle a specific location and a specific employment of a device. And it's typically an evaluation that can be done in just a couple of days, as opposed to some test programs can run weeks or months. But that field labeling is how you address that kind of a topic.
Next question. Where can I find a list of products that are required to be certified? I heard a general reference, but I missed the specific reference.
If you go to the Department of Labor's website, the OSHA website, you can search their database for documents related to that. And I believe that there is actually one on our website as well. The federal government has not done a real good job of laying down guidelines that exist in Europe. In Europe, if you have a device that goes from 50 to 1500 volts, it's going to fall under the low voltage directive. Excuse me. The OSHA program does not give a voltage range that's easy to look at and say, yes, this product definitely falls under this. A few years back, I wrote a letter to OSHA and said, we're having problems trying to tell our clients exactly what is not required to be tested. The response that they sent me, I believe, is somewhere available on our website. But what they said, in effect, was that battery-operated devices, those using dry cells, AA's, D batteries, single A's, unless those are used in a hazardous location, they're not required to be tested or an RTL mark. Anything that plugs into the mains is going to be required.
Here's a laboratory equipment specific question, Roland. Is IEC 61010-1 at 3rd edition now?
61010 3rd edition. I believe that in January, the new standard is going to be based on 2nd edition. I don't think it's 3rd edition, but I may be wrong.
Yeah, I think if I can jump in, I think it is at 3rd edition in Europe, and it's not at 3rd edition yet in the United States. So for the fall requirement for Europe, It is third edition to my understanding, but for the U.S. It's not. It's at second edition now. Next question. Who is responsible for ensuring that a product has an NRTL mark?
Okay, this is an interesting point. The requirement is that if a device is used in a workplace, it has to have an NRTL mark. Now, where does the burden fall? If you hire somebody to work in your business and you hand that person something to use in their work, it is your responsibility to ensure that that product have an NRTL mark. Manufacturers are not required to do testing and certification. Employers are required to provide to their employees only equipment that has an NRTL mark. Subsequently, this has fallen back onto the manufacturers because employers in the United States won't purchase equipment to use in their businesses unless it has an NRTL mark.
Okay, next question. What safety testing is required for a low voltage product that has no independent power supply, some to go inside a PC without their own enclosure, and others external to the PC in their own enclosures?
Okay, what it sounds like is it's a question regarding the recognition versus a listing. If you are a manufacturer and you manufacture components that go into other finished goods, typically a listing is not going to apply to your product. A listing applies to a finished product. So if you make expansion boards that go inside of desktop computers, rather than a listing, you're going to apply for a recognition. And a recognition is a different level of certification. And what it says is that this product is okay to use given this list of conditions of acceptability. So when you get a test report and it's a recognition, you're going to have a list of conditions of acceptability that product is good and has been tested and can operate within those parameters. Listings apply to finished goods, something that it can function on its own and does not require other things to operate. Did I answer the whole question?
I'm not sure, but if the listener isn't satisfied that you did, he or she is welcome to follow up by phone or by email.
Okay. Yeah, there are basically three different levels of classifications or listings or recognitions. Basically, a listing applies to a finished product. A recognition applies to a component or something that requires other devices to fulfill a purpose. And the last is a classification. And a classification is below a recognition and basically says that we tested this product, but there are some limitations on it above the conditions of acceptability that are going to apply to make this test report mean something.
Here's another question. What penalties exist where a product is put on the market displaying the mark that is discovered to be non-compliant?
Not being a lawyer, I'm not exactly sure what penalties exist. I have seen copies of letters that clients have received from other NRTLs who have found that either their listing expired or they transferred it to a different NRTL and they continue to label it with a previous NRTL's mark. And basically you're opening yourself up to civil litigation because the NRTL is likely going to issue a cease and desist order and take whatever remedies are available under the law. What OSHA's penalties are, I couldn't tell you. but I know that they're largely a reactive body, and usually their activity starts when they get a phone call from somebody who's either a competitor of somebody who's reporting a piece of equipment, or an employee who's reporting a piece of equipment that's not, properly labeled.
Here's another question. How do you compare Met and UL approval? And what is the advantage of Met over UL approval?
An NRTL mark from UL or ETL or CSA or Met or even TUV are all legally equivalent. The legal requirement is that if you're using this product in a workplace, it must bear an NRTL mark. There's nothing in any of the regulations that say that one NRTL is more valuable than another. Basically, your choice of NRTL labs is going to come down to who's easier to work with, who can get the job done in time. It could be dependent upon price, but any product that is marked with an NRTL mark is eligible to be used in a workplace in all of 50 states.
We have two questions from two different people that are very similar, so I'm going to read both of them. Are there any exclusions for military equipment? And then the second question, does the OSHA requirements extend to the U.S. military and equipment used by services personnel?
Okay, the Department of Defense publishes its own criteria, and many of their categories of equipment are exempt from NRTL requirements. If you're making military equipment and you want to sell to the Department of Defense, usually it's very, very clear in their requests for proposals what's required. So I would imagine if they're going to be using, if you're making a product for the military and they're going to use it in, say, a kitchen, they may have an NRTL requirement on that. If it's something that could go into a tank or an airplane, it might not require it. You're just going to have to look at the requests on a case-by-case basis. But the military, as well as many of the utilities, are exempt from NRTL requirements. And the feeling with respect to utilities is that there's a term that they use. It's called behind the fence. And in America, you can be driving down the highway and you see these huge substations, and they're surrounded by these very tall fences with barbed wire at the top. And equipment that goes behind that fence is often relieved from the burden of an NRTL mark, just because only people who are specially trained to work in those areas are allowed to access that equipment. And the assumption is that they know what they're doing and they're not going to be endangered by a piece of equipment.
Okay, here's another question. Am I correct in thinking that an NRTL mark is also required for all mains-powered electrical/electronic equipment, whether it's used in the workplace or not, in some states and cities, for example, Washington, Oregon, North Carolina, and Los Angeles?
Well, again, if it's going to be used in a workplace, no question, it's going to require an NRTL mark. If it's going to be used in a home, it's strictly in a home, there is no requirement legally. However, if you're going to try to sell that product through a distributor or a major retailer, chances are very, very high that they're going to have the same requirement. They're going to require that the product be, it's going to display an NRTL mark, and it comes back down to liability. They do not want to take the chance of exposing themselves to litigation if somebody gets hurt using your product.
Here's a medical specific question. Is NRTL required in addition to a FDA 510K clearance for a medical device?
I've heard multiple answers to this question, and a medical office or a hospital is considered a workplace, and strictly speaking, even though the FDA often their requirements are tested to the same standards, they do not have the same surveillance as the NRTL program. So, legally speaking, if that medical device is used in a place that's considered a workplace, it is going to require an NRTL mark.
Here's another question. For bespoke control panels going to Canada, we have the equipment independently field certified to CSA. For products going to the U.S., we don't normally need to go through the same process. Any ideas why? Our U.S. customers import the equipment. Is it their responsibility or the manufacturer's?
Again, the NRTL requirement legally falls on to the person who is giving that equipment to somebody to use in their work. So the company who installs that equipment, they purchase it, they set it in their place of business, and they have people working with it. It's their responsibility to make sure that that product is NRTL marked. Over the years, I've gotten dozens and dozens of requests of people who have started, pizza shops or small cement companies, all kinds of different businesses, and they call up and they just say, hey, I was just going through my inspection, I just opened up this business, and the electrical inspector told me that this used pizza mixer I bought, it can't be used because it doesn't have an NRTL mark. And that's an instance where you may have a piece of equipment that's been around for years and years, and here it's finally being put into a situation where an inspector is looking at it and it doesn't have an NRTL mark. The manufacturer in that case is not liable for that mark. It's whoever is going to be paying somebody to use that equipment.
Okay. Does an electricity meter tested to ANSI C12.20 require further certification for safety?
C12.20 is basically a performance and accuracy standard. We do a lot of testing for that kind of a product, and it's kind of 50-50 as to whether or not they actually do a safety evaluation on that. Some people say that it applies to utility equipment and it's considered behind the fence. There is a standard that exists, and it's UL 916, that is for energy management equipment. Some people get it, some people don't. It really depends upon who you're trying to sell that meter to. If you're selling it to California, you may want to check with, I believe it's the California Energy Commission, and see if it's a requirement in California. Ohio might be different. It just comes down to whoever the authority having jurisdiction is in that area.
Okay, here's a follow-up question. Does behind the fence NRTL marking exemption apply to telecoms equipment for central office only installations?
Yes. If you have a piece of equipment that is only going to be used in the central office forever, that equipment is going to be exempt from NRTL requirements under the utility provision. If, however, you're going to use that product in data centers, or if it's going to be on customer premises, it's going to be required. Also, telecom equipment usually has to comply with NEBS requirements, and dependent upon which provider you're trying to sell the equipment to, Verizon or AT&T or one of the other telcos, they may have requirements specifically for an NRTL mark. You really have to look at them as a case-by-case basis.
Okay, here's another question. If a workshop is built into an ISO container, does the whole container need certification or the individual items inside?
I'm not really that familiar with ISO standards. you may want to check with whoever you're trying to sell this to. But the equipment inside of it is obviously a workplace, so that the individual pieces are going to be required to be NRTL marked.
Here's a question. If equipment is only installed by professional installers, is NRTL required?
Yes. It doesn't matter who installs the equipment. If somebody is going to be paid to operate the equipment, it has to have an NRTL mark. There are considerations other than the safety of the people installing the equipment that are going to be evaluated by a safety standard. If you look back at the hazards, the shock and sharp edges and accessibility to high voltage, those things all apply to people who are using the equipment, not installing it. So yes, beyond a doubt, people have to have those marked.
Okay, and final question here. Please come back to the advantages of Met Labs versus other NRTL laboratories.
Well, sometimes it's kind of hard to draw the distinctions because we are all accredited by OSHA, and we all have to meet the same requirements. Some of the ways that I think Met Labs tends to set itself apart is when it comes to inspections. The law requires that a minimum of 2 inspections be performed for standards that are not hazardous. So if you have a 6950 product or a 61010 or one of the other standards that are not classified as hazardous locations, we're only required to do 2 inspections per year. Now, almost every NRTL that I know of, other than us, requires 4 inspections a year. And the reason for that is money. There's a lot of money to be made in inspections. We find that requiring more than the minimum is a burden to our clients. And it's not so much just the money that is charged to do an inspection, it's the lost time that it takes to deal with an inspector when he walks through the door. The regulations require that these are unannounced, and basically if you're working with a lab that's going to do 4 inspections a year, you're potentially going to lose a half day of work 4 times a year in a time that you don't expect it because of inspectors walking in and they want to do an inspection. So I think that's a big difference between Met and the other NRTLs, is that we don't have the same requirement when it comes to inspections. Also, we are not, I consider us to be more nimble than some of the larger NRTLs. I don't like to talk poorly about any other lab, but one client described to me, he said, working with UL is like trying to water ski behind a oil tanker. He said that it's just, they're very unresponsive, very bureaucratic, and that's something we're very sensitive to. And I think that one of the comments that I get from a lot of our clients is that we tend to move a little bit faster than some of the other agencies.